He got grandfathered, and he's the only person on earth who did. But so wait. So a constitutional amendment, and exactly one person on earth got grandfathered. Got it. Okay. March 31st, 1952. You are a leader, a national leader. You've actually led your country for the better part of a decade. And though you've had big ups and downs in terms of popularity, everyone thinks you at least want to continue the job. Well, this week, you tell them that you don't. I'm Indy Nidell, and this is the Korean War. Last week, Operation Mixmaster was in action all week long, moving the U.S. 1st Marine Division westward from the mountains of central Korea to near the coast. It involved moving around a lot of other units as well, though, since some guys have to replace some others, and then they have to move along elsewhere. And everyone involved has tons and tons of equipment and vehicles to move as well. It was nearly done by the week's end. The big news this week, though, is from half a world away in Washington, and it concerns U.S. President Harry Truman. President Harry Truman had carried a secret around with him since April 16, 1950, a full 2 months before the Korean War began. He did not intend to run for re-election. When his term ended, he would have been in public office 30 years. In my opinion, 8 years as president is enough, and sometimes too much for any man to serve in that capacity, Truman wrote in his private diary. There is a lure in power. It can get into a man's blood, just as gambling and lust for money have been known to do. But Truman never announced this decision. Okay, he privately had words with Chief Supreme Court Justice Fred Vinson because he thought Vinson would be a great candidate to succeed him. But Vinson has health issues. Over the last few months, though, Truman has been slowly but surely letting other Democratic Party leaders know he's not going to run again. By January, he began thinking that Illinois Governor Adlai Stevenson would maybe be the best all-around candidate to succeed him. They met twice, but Stevenson wouldn't give him a yes or no answer about actually running. Well, he still hasn't. But this week on the 29th, Harry Truman makes what is a big surprise announcement at the Jefferson Jackson Day dinner at the National Guard Armory in Washington. He announces that he will not run for another term. Now, you may be saying, whoa, hang on a second. Last year, February 27, 1951, the 22nd Amendment to the Constitution was ratified by the required 36 out of the 48 states. Section 1 clearly states, no person shall be elected to the office of the president more than twice, and no person who has held the office of president or acted as president for more than 2 years of a term to which some other person was elected president shall be elected to the office of the president more than once. So how could Truman be eligible even if he did want to run? I mean, he became president when Franklin Roosevelt died in 1945, and he was elected in 1948. So he served more than 2 years of Roosevelt's term. See, Section 1 also states that this article shall not apply to any person holding the office of president when this article was proposed by the Congress, and shall not prevent any person who may be holding the office of president or acting as president during the term within which this article becomes operative from holding the office of president or acting as president during the remainder of such term. So Truman is grandfathered should he want to run again. I don't know just how well Harry Truman would do if he does decide to run again, though, considering the series of scandals that have plagued his administration. That Joseph Golden book I just quoted touches on them a bit. Corruption in the federal tax service, 5%ers who pushed government contracts to friends in return for such payoffs as mink coats, funneling of Reconstruction Finance Corporation loans to such speculative ventures as gambling casinos in Miami and Las Vegas, with payments to such high Democratic officials as William M. Boyle Jr., the party's vice chairman, easing the paperwork. Although no one ever accused Truman of taking a dime, the aura of hustlers permeated the White House. Cumulatively, the Truman scandals were Washington's sorriest hour since the Teapot Dome affair of the Harding years. Truman really has paid a high price in public support. Near the end of 1950, Gallup polls had his favorability rating at 46%. But this was his high water mark, and in the last year, his approval has never gotten above 32% and has fallen as low as 23%. So since he only has the support of roughly 1 out of 4 Americans, if he ran again, well, it seems to me like it would be an uphill battle. Who might he run against? Theoretically, he might run against the big war hero, Supreme Allied Commander in World War II, Dwight Eisenhower, whom literally everyone calls Ike. Ike has a serious reputation for both strength and decency. People of both major parties have tried to get him to run for the presidency since the war. And Truman said more than once in public that he would have stood aside for him in 1948. But it was only towards the end of last year that Ike began dropping hints to Republican visitors to his Paris office that maybe he'd want to run in 1952. Post-World War II, he was Army Chief of Staff, President of Columbia University, and the first commander of NATO. Based in Paris, he established Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe, SHAPE, to organize Western European defenses against the Soviet threat. His reasoning for maybe running, I say maybe because that's what it is in part because of Korea. He sees very deep dissatisfaction in the U.S. over Truman's handling of the war. He told Herbert Brownwell this. Brownwell is former chairman of the Republican National Committee. And he also told him he thought he could get the Republican nomination just by issuing a statement. Brownwell says winning the nomination would probably be harder than winning the actual election. Why? Because Ohio Senator Robert Taft would be running as well. See, in 1940, the Republicans nominated Wendell Willkie, and in 44 and 48, Thomas Dewey. And Taft's Midwestern isolationists thought of those guys as Eastern internationalists. The Tafties think 1952 is their turn. Well, whoever does run for either party, it shall be quite interesting. As for the war and its conduct, Operation Mixmaster is winding up this week, moving the U.S. 1st Marine Division westward from the mountains of central Korea to positions at the west end of the Jamestown line. By the 25th, except for some artillery, the whole thing is complete. It was a masterful feat of logistics, but there's also a downside. The first Marine casualty on the Western Front happens March 24th, when a Marine trips a landmine. More such casualties follow. More than 30 Marine casualties occurred during the relief. Although not a heavy loss, the casualties were all the more tragic because so many resulted from snipers and landmines, which indicated an unfamiliarity with the terrain and enemy positions. Mixmaster had happened too rapidly and without sufficient reconnaissance. The Marines found, for example, that many of the ROK minefields near their positions were poorly marked, or in some cases were not marked at all. Too frequently, they discover the minefields the hard way. And the Marines are no longer facing what are often war-weary KPA, North Korean soldiers, but battle-hardened Chinese ones who are aware that the Marines have replaced the ROK, the South Koreans, locally and send out patrols to test them out. I said last week the newcomers' first impression is that this region will be easier to defend, or at least be more livable. But first impressions are not always correct. The Jamestown line runs east from the Kimpo Peninsula on the Yellow Sea, and within the defense area is the Imjin River Basin where the Imjin and the Han rivers meet. Now, where the Marines were before was mountainous land. And around here are only low hills and wide, broad valleys. And for centuries, this has been the invasion route towards Seoul and the plains to the south. Here, very much unlike the mountains in the east, tanks and large-scale vehicular movement are easy to support. So it may be easier to defend from smaller, unmechanized attacks than the mountains would be, but that's not likely to be the sort of attacks they encounter here. The Jamestown line itself heads northeast across the peninsula and actually crosses the 38th parallel. The Marines, who have been reinforced with a regiment of Korean Marines, have like 60 kilometers of front to look after now. And with their backs against the Imjin River, they do not have a lot of wiggle room, and they are dependent on bridge traffic for supplies. 3 of their bridges are temporary structures that either function or do not function according to the vagaries of flooding and weather. Something else. 60 kilometers is a lot to look after for just one division, even reinforced. A lot. And this is likely to be a major issue because they are really spread thin. Just how thin is best illustrated by comparing the deployment with the doctrine of the U.S. Army, which was responsible for deploying the 1st Division. Typical Army policy at the time called for an infantry division to defend approximately 8,000 to 9,000 yards of line. The 1st Marine Division was called on to defend more than 60,000 yards of line, 6 times the recommended amount of real estate. So the still evolving defense strategy looks to be a thinly manned main line of resistance, MLR, which is protected by a bunch of forward outposts and mobile reserves in the rear. Should there be an enemy invasion in force, the outposts are the early warning system. But the MLR units would be expected to hold their positions until help can arrive. One coincidental bonus for the U.S. Marines is that the terrain here is fairly similar to that of Camp Pendleton near San Diego, where they trained, so there is at least that. There's been a development in Operation Strangle, the UN's aerial campaign to destroy the logistics of the enemy. The spring thaws have finally arrived, and with it, a new phase of the operation called Operation Saturate. This involves having air power hit like a specific stretch of railroad around the clock and hopefully play havoc with enemy rail service. They tried this March 25th and 26th, targeting the line between Cheongju and Sinanju. They used 307 fighter bombers, 161 fighters, and 8 B-26s. But the results are disappointing. The breaks are repaired within 6 days, and of course, focusing there means other areas are free from any interference. One real problem is that the UN doesn't really have effective techniques for keeping the campaign going at night and in bad weather. And it is at night and in bad weather that the enemy is organized to deal with the bombing by fixing it quite quickly. It is becoming more and more apparent that the air power they have is not enough to make the sustained effort required to keep enemy railways out of action. It is also apparent, as I have discussed before, that the extra air power needed to do the job is absolutely not forthcoming. However, the campaign has been of pretty big value anyhow. Here's an 8th Army report from mid-March about it. The success of the interdiction program can be best estimated by assuming its absence. If there had been no Operation Strangle, the enemy would now have a railhead in the vicinity of Sibyong-ni, served by an excellent double-track line, and in the central sector he would have another important railhead somewhere between Pyongyang and Seppo-ri. In this event, his expenditure of artillery and mortar ammunition could have been increased many times. The air interdiction program has not been able to prevent the enemy from accumulating supplies at the front in a static situation. It has, however, been a major factor in preventing the enemy from attaining equality or superiority in artillery and other weapons employed at the front. Thus, it has also decreased the offensive and defensive capability of the enemy. Well, that's enemy army strength. How about the South Koreans? U.S. Secretary of the Navy Dan Kimball has returned from Korea to Washington, and he brings with him the news that 8th Army Commander Jim Van Fleet wants to increase the size of the ROK Army to 20 divisions. The Joint Chiefs of Staff and UN Commander Matt Ridgway envision a future ROK Army of 10 divisions of 250,000 men. But Van Fleet is more in line with South Korean President Syngman Rhee and the South Korean government. Kimball reports this news to the Army Policy Council, and there is much rending of garments and gnashing of teeth, or there's consternation, partly because they're actually getting this news from the Navy. Well, they asked Ridgway about this, and he is as surprised as they are. And he asks Van Fleet if he really does want a ROK Army expansion to 20 divisions. Van Fleet maintained the ROK had the manpower and the desire to fight, and the United States could support ROK troops in Korea much more economically than American forces. As a conclusion to a somewhat amazing performance, Van Fleet referred his commander to an interview he had just published in U.S. News and World Report if Ridgway desired more information on his views. That interview comes out the 28th, by the way. Ridgway tells General Hull from Army Policy He disagrees with Van Fleet on doubling the ROK army. He does not believe the South Korean economy could sustain such an expansion, but moreover, he thinks it more important to develop Japanese defensive forces. They should take precedence. And sure, the current ROK training program for the 10-division army is bearing fruit, but it won't be finished for another 10 months. Organizing 10 more divisions would take 18 months from the start to getting them ready for action. And the U.S. will have to foot the bill for clothing, for food, for salaries. Ridgway has a great deal of respect for Van Fleet, but he has this to say. His outlook in this particular case is, in my opinion, quite focused almost exclusively on the Korean situation, as that situation affects the U.S. I cannot believe due consideration has been accorded to the inseparable relation of the Japanese, Chinese nationalists, and Southeast Asia military programs to which the United States government is committed, or which it has understudy. I mentioned recently that Ridgway and U.S. Ambassador to Seoul, John Muccio, wanted to send a mission from Washington to Korea to work on U.S. ROK relations in general, which have been going sour recently for a variety of reasons. Rampant inflation, the ROK attitude towards an armistice, things like that. Well, this week on the 28th, President Truman names Clarence Meyer, serving as the head of the Mutual Security Administration mission to Austria, chief of this new delegation. The State Department will monitor this new mission, which is directed to negotiate financial, economic, and other appropriate arguments between the United States or the Unified Command and the Republic of Korea. That's from the draft directive. And that is where I will leave you for today, with Mixmaster concluding and Chinese patrols against the Marines beginning, more attempts to sabotage the communist supply lines, and a shocking news announcement from the president. Harry Truman is not going to run for president again. So 1953 will find the United States with a new leader, and perhaps this war with a new direction. Will it be Ike? He's got to have a different perspective. This is the man from World War II. The thing is, for all this war's unpopularity, what could he do differently? What would he do differently? And he'd have to win first. Taft, one must expect, would just bring the troops home. He has no interest in foreign conflicts. Well, at this point, we don't know who is going to run, only who is not. But it is going to be a different world in 1953 and a different war. And yet, I will be here to tell you all about it, assuming the war lasts into the new year. I can do that thanks to the endeavors of the Time Ghost Army, for it is the Army that allows me to do all of this on any and all of our channels. You can join the Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. And Bill Calkins is the Army Member of the Week here. Do not forget to subscribe. See you next time.